So we'll start with a very brief overview of what we're actually dealing with in terms of script, language, and what we have. Our corpus, so we're situated in ancient Anatolia and up to the region that is now northern Syria. And these hieroglyphic inscriptions date roughly from about 800 years, so circa 1500 to 700 BCE. And so at the beginning of the period where the script was used during the Bronze Age, you have a situation where there are two scripts being used. The cuneiform script that the Hittites used to write thousands and thousands of clay tablets with. And then you have the hieroglyphic script. And so one of the main differences is the materiality of writing. We find cuneiform very much on clay tablets. And then we do find some seals with cuneiform.
And the seal really is the one type of written object where you can find both scripts. Otherwise, they don't tend to come together. The hieroglyphs are very much the monumental script, so they're preserved on relief inscriptions. And you can also see that we have a bit of a development in terms of what is being recorded with it. So the earliest phase that we can date and grasp has names and titles, and then we're slowly moving into longer text. Then there's also the issue of, we know they also wrote on other materials. One thing that's quite certain, because there are a lot of references in the cuneiform tablets to it, is that they wrote on wooden writing boards, but they don't say in which script. So theoretically, either would be possible. The interesting thing is, after roughly 1200 BC, end of the Bronze Age, when the Hittite Empire perishes, and then we're entering into a somewhat darkish period, although it's getting lighter for us researching this. After that, in the Iron Age, we find the hieroglyphs are still there, and cuneiform in this region has disappeared, and nobody knows why. And if you think about it in terms of, these are both scribal scripts very much, and what is the political scenario in which the cuneiform scribe perishes and the hieroglyphic one survives? I don't quite see that. So this is a conundrum. Very much, almost everything that's written in the hieroglyphic script is in one language only, Luwian. The real exceptions are a few words here and there, and mainly personal names. So Luwian is one of the Indo-European languages, and if you want to use one of those tree models, you would have the Anatolian branch, which is now extinct, and within that is a sub-branch that is called Luwic, and Luwian is one of those. And it's actually even attested in several dialects. Also, just very, very briefly, so we have about 800 years of this script being written. We find it mainly on stone. There are some examples on metal. There are a few hieroglyphic scribbles on clay. And we presume it would have existed on other material, but we don't have it. So because of that, we have particular text genres that are preserved. You can imagine a stone monument lends itself not to everyday communication, but so we have building inscriptions, commemorative inscriptions, dedications, the occasional deed or record of something, a contract. And then on metal strip, we have letters. And then, of course, we have epigraphs to relieve depictions. There are graffiti, and we have seal legends. And I'll just very, very briefly show you some pictures just so you get a visual idea of how these things look like. So you see here on the left you have a relief figure, and then there are some hieroglyphs telling us a bit more about who this is. You see here a statue which carries an inscription on the back. Likewise, this portal lion, he carries an inscription across the body. And here on the right, you see a rock facade that's inscribed with writing. Similarly, the picture on the bottom, that's also on a rock surface in situ, but here it's more of a epigraph to the pictorial scene and not a fully fledged text. We have little things like this stone over here that's interpreted as a scribal sign. And this was someone's idea of how that may have worked in real life, that you would put up a sign for your scribal services and somebody could hire you. Who knows? We also find, similarly to these pictorial scenes on stone, you find something like that here on a silver drinking vessel. And just to show you here on the left, that of course does not come from this region and it doesn't have hieroglyphs on there, but that's the type of wooden tablet that was common in antiquity. So we imagine they would have used those. Here on the left you see one of the few surviving lead scripts, and they were then rolled up, so you could also presumably put them on a string or so and carry them with you. It's a very nice material actually to write on. It's quite pliable and good fun if you want to try that. And here on the bottom right we have a clay tablet with, you see here a little bit better in the drawing, it's a lion, and that's of course also a sign of writing. So if we look at the historical development a little bit, we find very early on little symbols on, for instance, vessels, and some of them we find at a later stage clearly as signs of writing. The big question is, this early stuff, should that already be connected to it, or is it just that at some point when they're developing the script, they're using symbols that have been around culturally for a while? This is a gap we cannot currently bridge. So the first proper writing surface that we can nicely see, although the picture is changing slightly there, so it may actually no longer be the seal, is a bit of a difficult one because there are a few outlying pieces of evidence now that not all of them are very clearly datable. So let's stick with this for the moment, but be aware the picture might change in the future. So you've got the seal and you're working around the center of the seal with your writing. So here this is the shape for a royal seal with the title Great King on either side. In the middle you'd have the name hieroglyphs, and then you have this winged sun disk at the top. And then from the seal they're taking that type of writing onto blocks of stone. And you see here, this is a very early example, which still very much follows the visual arrangement. So you have this big figure in the middle that really draws the attention as the focal point. And you're still writing very much from top down as you have it on the seal. And the next step then would be here the use within pictorial scenes, and I also want to draw the attention to the fact that you're really at an intersection of art and writing in this script and in this culture, because writing with picture signs, of course, for a start, these hieroglyphic signs very much have the same style as the artistic scenes. And clearly the people writing with it are aware of the similarity and maybe connection between the two, so they're playing with this as well. If you look at the right example, you see there this picture of a person pointing at himself. That is actually the first sign of writing, but it's blown up. So he's likewise a picture of himself, but he's also a sign of writing. So once we get to proper text in inscriptions, one thing that happens is we have a somewhat different arrangement. So we now have lines of text, which of course if you have only a few words you don't need lines in plural form. And so within each line you have columns with 2, 3 signs on top of each other. Just if you check on the other side there where you have the inscription, you can see it's not like in some other scripts where you have an ideal square which needs to be filled with the sign. These are all of a different size. So that's why it's not neatly always 2 signs on top of each other. And then the other thing you have is you've got this boustrophodon writing arrangement. So every line drops over and then returns in the other direction as the ox plows. And you may wonder why they do that. It's actually a very unusual writing direction. A few scripts do it and give it up very early, and this one sees it through for 800 years. Now, my personal idea to this is it might be the size of the monuments they're dealing with, because just to give you an idea here of the size, and you see you have quite a few lines of text. So if you go and read one line and it's, I don't know, 6 meters in width, it's quite useful to then walk back from there with the next line of text. So maybe it's a question of the walkability of these inscriptions. So just to bring that together a little bit, we're going in the Bronze Age. We don't know whether markings are the starting point of writing, but they are there and they're there early. And then clearly we start with writing on the seals. We then move on to reliefs and graffiti, and then we're getting inscriptions. Through the Iron Age that goes on, and we also then have a few, but really very, very few private documents on lead strips. And with that, I want to move on to signs. So one of the first questions actually that people tend to ask is, how many signs are there? To which I can say, well, our sign list has about roughly 530 now, but that's of course in any case not the correct number. And the reasons are several. Also, research over its history has then abandoned some numbers, changed its views on what actually forms one sign, but we also we're not quite clear sometimes where the boundary between one sign and a different one is. So just to give you an example, if I have the depiction of a seal and it's a stamp seal seen from the side, and I have a different depiction that shows just a seal surface, and we know they use it for the same sound value, but in the sign list we actually separate these two because to us they look very different. But possibly to the scribe, that was the same sign with a permissible change in the perspective they're adopting. So these are questions we can't answer, which is why so we have sign numbers in the 500s. We don't know any good estimates of how an ancient scribe would have seen that. The general principle is that every sign has one semantic and one phonetic value, and the phonetic sign value is normally derived by acrophony, as much as we can determine that at all. And you will see here one thing that I'm doing you may disagree with. I say so the signs have the value consonant plus vowel, and we have the 3 vowels A, I, and U, and then I include an indifferent A or I also as just one sound and not several, and I'll show you in a moment why I do that, because I don't think it's about multiplicity, it's more about simplicity here. In general, there are homophone signs, so we have, I think the largest series we have is the SAR series, which has about 8 variants, and then for the semantic signs, one of the things that, of course, we are not native speakers, so transcribing these semantic signs in Luwian, we fail very, very quickly because we just don't have the vocabulary, which is why it's transcribed in Latin. So if you see that in the transcription, we're not claiming anything that Latin plays a role here, it's just a standard so that we're not advancing a particular modern language, and that's all there is to it. In terms of the phonetic structure, it's actually more limited than what you'd find in cuneiform, and I would argue that's a deliberate choice because the same scribes sometimes knew both scripts, so they must have been aware of other value possibilities structurally. So normally it's consonant plus vowel, and sometimes this is doubled as a sequence, and there are very few examples that are different. And I'll show you one later. So the reason why we have this very widespread AI possibility in science, I think, has to do with keeping writing stable. And this is something that reflects a linguistic issue of Luwian. In Luwian, we have something called I mutation. And not too important to go into details here, but what happens is that in the stem, you have this I suffix that appears, but not in all stems, not in all cases. So the same word as you have here on the right will be found with an I in some cases and with an A in other cases. And I think that's the reason why you have these types of signs, because this way, if you just look at a hieroglyphs, the first two signs always stay the same, and then you can have your other sign for the ending. Whereas if you couldn't have this AI fluctuation here, you have to change the sign, which would make recognition of the same word a lot more difficult. So I think this is something they invented to make their life easier. And I don't particularly want to go and answer the question whether it's been influenced by other scripts in its inception. That's a tough one, and we can anyhow only speculate. I do think we find interference that argues for the proximity, in this case really with cuneiform, and that's not been majorly explored. So of course the reason why interference between scripts is not a big subject, I would argue, in general, is of course a lot of writing systems research in the past has subscribed to this model of we're moving from more basic to more advanced, and then of course we wouldn't want to or wouldn't expect to have interference. So I think it can work on the basis that two scripts are in contact with one each other, and also they need to be structurally similar, otherwise the hurdle is a lot higher. And of course this is the case for cuneiform and hieroglyphic. And so I've got two ways that might play a role here. One is xenography, which is adopting a sign from a different script, and with that breaking what's actually permissible in yours. And this happens, and you see here the example in German with the French C with the, what is it, the cedilla? And you do that particularly to write specific foreign words. You don't generally do that to write your own words. And the other principle is mimesis, where we're introducing a structural similarity, because that then facilitates the borrowing. You see here this lovely little insect that looks like a leaf, and then in contrast to other leaves, it can actually walk about. So I think we have an instance, and I have a few more examples, but I'll only bore you with one, in the hieroglyphic script, and that would be one way of explaining a few signs that structurally don't actually work with what we think the script is doing. So here we have a sign that has first the vowel, then the consonant, which the hieroglyphs don't normally do, with very, very few exceptions, whereas in cuneiform that's a perfectly permissible structure. And so I think what happens here is they're so used to writing, and this happens particularly in this divine name, Shaushka. They're used to writing it in cuneiform in that kind of sequence, and then for the hieroglyphs, they're designing a sign that clearly looks hieroglyphic. However, it's originally motivated, but I think it's a copy from a cuneiform model here. Another question, and that also bears on the question how many signs we have, is what do we do with compounds? And the first issue is how do we even define a compound? So we can have signs in ligature and we can have compounds. So to me the difference would be a ligature is more of a temporary structure, whereas a compound becomes fixed. Now the sign list itself here is really not helpful if you want to study that, because it's absolutely not consistent in how it treats compounds. So the other thing is, do we always understand every single part of a sign pictorially? And of course we do not. So we may very well miss compounds just for the reason that we haven't understood what's going on there. And sometimes you find parts of a compound not on its own, but you can still identify them because you find the other part of the compound on its own. But so this is again something where we might be missing a lot that goes on. And then again, there's a question of what are these compounds or ligatures or whatever we have, what are they doing? Are they forming new words, new meanings? Or is it just in apposition, in proximity? So there's a lot of different stuff that happens there, and this has not been properly sorted out, and neither am I doing that for you here. I just want to toss out a few ideas. So for a start, we actually need a good way of describing our compounds, and I'm just borrowing here from psychology, because we're talking about how do they connect, yeah? How do they attach? So psychology has these 4 styles: secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, which I thought in a nice way I could steal. So we have proximal signs that clearly form a compound. They may or may not just about touch. Well, then we have the ones that are clearly touching, and maybe they're touching a bit too much, who knows, they might be anxious. We have integration, that's a very secure compound, and then I like the disorganized category for anything that we don't understand, of course. So this is an area that needs further study. And I'm sorry for the quality of this slide, I don't know what's going on here. So if we look at sign function, so we differentiated earlier in terms of sign value, we have semantic and phonetic, but then we actually have different functions for these values as well. So a semantic sign can work as a logogram, where it just represents a full word, and you're supposed to read this word as well. Or it can work as a semantic classifier, where you're reading it, but you're not supposed to put it into language. It's just a reading aid that helps you compute. And we'll look at that in much more detail. Same happens actually on the phonetic level. The phonetic sign also works either, and this is the majority, of course, of phonetic use, as a sign to represent sound, but we actually have also a very distinct category of phonetic classifiers where they take on a different function, and we will look at that. So that said, we have so many ways of how you can write one word, and this is where it gets interesting for anyone interested in writing systems. There is, on the one hand side, there is stability and there are clear rules, but there is so much variation that is possible. So if you look here at the word for sheep, which of course the ovis is just a help to us. Nobody in ancient Anatolia would ever have said ovis. They would have said hawis. And so you can just use the sheep sign as a logogram, that's it. And of course, the disadvantage is if you have it in a sentence, you don't actually know the grammatical form it should take and so on. So it's actually good to add some phonetic information. And so they start from the back with the grammatical ending. That makes a lot of sense. Once you're doing that, you might want to add a little bit more from the stem. And of course, you can also just write it fully phonetically. And interestingly, in the development of the script, they seem to have felt then writing just phonetically doesn't quite hit everything. And then they add the logogram again at the front of it. And that's the situation where we say this is not a logogram, but it functions as a classifier, because we don't have to read the sheep word twice. We read it once. And to my mind, there's also even one example where we have a phonetic classifier with the sheep sign. And here it works on the basis, you saw earlier, it's hawis. You just emphasize the edge of the word, so the H is important, and they purposefully here avoid the same vowel and choose a different one. So you see, alone in the structure of how you can combine different types of sign, there are many possibilities. And then on top of that, what you can of course do is you can use a homophone sign for any of those phonetic signs. So possibilities are endless. So with that, I want to say a few words about the modalities of writing and the iconicity of this script. Again, these are little pieces from here and there. This won't give you the full picture. But in general, when we're considering inscriptions like this, so we already have quite a complex situation where we clearly have a viewer and a reader, and they're distinct. This is a complicated script. Clearly, not everybody would have been able to read, and writing as well is firmly in the hand of trained scribes. I personally don't think that you could learn the script well enough to write it badly as a non-trained person. I mean, the one thing that might change this if one ever found temporary records that only used a very limited subset of the script, but so far we don't have that. Everything that we have is complex. So also the person who commissions something that's written is not identical with the person executing it. So you have the producers on the one hand side, you have the addressees on the other, and it may be also that there is a deliberate address to people just viewing it, who cannot read it. Big question is, will it be read to them? That's quite possible, maybe in certain contexts socially. So when we're then trying to deal with an inscription, of course the content is interesting, the language is interesting, but also the context in which you find this kind of monument. And then for those of us interested in writing, the script is worthy of studying on its own, and the iconicity of it is also hugely interesting. So I've got here just one sentence for you. Now I hope that there are a lot of people here who might not be able to read it. So if you're just looking at it, you're a viewer. One thing that you might be doing is you might start looking from the left, because you see there are various faces in there and they're all looking to the left, and it's quite a human instinct to face other faces. So this actually also gives us a hint of the direction of reading. Now then, if you have a functional level of reading without fantastic fluency, you would read every sign little by little, one after the other in sequence, and it would take a while to reconstruct the language from that. And if you were a fluent reader, you would pick up on a few other cues that if you were less fluent you wouldn't see, and I'll explain those to you in the next slide. So, for instance, I've marked here the word boundary. So you see each of these, I don't want to call them squares, rough whatevers, shapes. That's a word. And you see there's nothing neat and tidy about it. So how did they know where to stop between words? Because you've got to stop somewhere. And there are actually indications that a fluent reader would very nicely recognize. So one of the things is all of these signs that I've marked in the light blue color. These are logograms, or in the instance of the first one and also the last one, they actually act as classifiers, but somebody who reads this a lot would probably notice, okay, this is likely the beginning of a word. Then there are a few marking signs. There's a marking sign here that marks that a sign is a logogram or a classifier, so a semantic sign. There are signs that mark the beginning of a word. There are signs that mark the end of a word. So with all of these cues, somebody who's familiar and reads a lot would have some help in segmentation. So I think this is very much a priming effect that we're seeing here. And I want to talk a little bit about the iconicity of the script. Again, I'm just picking up on how some signs work, and that doesn't give you everything the script does, but it gives you some categories. So I'm following in terms of the terminology. I'm very much inspired by Andreas Stauder, an Egyptologist who has worked on Egyptian hieroglyphs with this terminology, and I think it's quite applicable for us here as well. So here we have referential iconicity, where we have the sign form motivated by some kind of visual referent in the world out there. It doesn't come from the system. And there are then different strategies of how they do depiction of things in the world out there. If you want, this is the most basic category of how you can have a sign. So I can just do a direct depiction. I draw what I see, and that's what the sign means. That has its limits. So they then go into associating things with other things, and you can describe that very nicely in the kind of terminology that you use to describe language, styles, tropes, and so on. So for instance, you see here the sign for the king is actually the hat that he wears, which is much easier to recognize than if I draw a king and the next king looks different. So how do I recognize that he's a king? Because he wears the royal hat. And then a third principle that very nicely also is something anyone who's ever done little crossword and other puzzles has come across the Weber's principle. So we're using the association of the sound to gain our meaning. And that's, of course, incredibly useful if you have things that you cannot draw. Think of abstract concepts. How do you draw time? Okay, yeah, you can do your wristwatch these days, but they didn't have one. So these are some of the strategies that we find. And but direct depiction then, again, is something where I would expect us to miss quite a bit of the connotations and sometimes the entire meaning as well. So, for instance, we have a huge category of different vessel shapes. Now there we can talk to our friends in archaeology and say, okay, what have you got for us? Do you have a vessel like that? Sadly, a lot of them look more like the bottom picture than the top one. And of course, the drawings also have their limitations. But you see here, we have some kind of relation to the world that was there that we can at least try and find. But then, I don't know, do you have any suggestions what these two signs could depict? Nobody's worked it out so far, and I have a feeling this is our mistake because we don't have the cultural context that they had. I would expect that someone from the period would have understood what this was. Then we have derivational iconicity, where we have signs motivated by the addition of an extra element or an extra sign. So you have here at the top a series where you have a diacritical element that is added, presumably actually also derived from another sign, and that gives me here this sequence where we have an additional A vocalization with these two double bars at the bottom. But we also have then the compounding, and that happens in both the phonetic and the semantic range. The next one that we have is differential iconicity, where signs are motivated through their contrast to other signs. And so we're now really system internal, and this is quite a complex writing where we have this bird figure, and the bird alone already has the value ara or ari. And then this is added as sort of diacritical marks. You see this little pokey bit that he has at the back, that's the sign ra or ri. And I would argue, on the basis of the very last version of this sign, bottom right, where you have suddenly these two double bars, that is what they're trying to indicate with the outstretched wing. So that also acts as a diacritical mark. It's quite redundant and quite beautiful. So it's complex, and somebody's playing with it. The next interesting category is sequential iconicity, where we have the signs, again, motivated in contrast with other signs, but as a sequence. And to understand this, you really need to know groups of signs, otherwise you will miss what is significant here. So this is a series that all centers around the head or the lack of a head. So if you look at the top row, you have these three signs where somebody is holding something in their hand, and you see the first one and the third one, and they're holding the same thing. And the difference is whether you've got a head there or not. And when the head is present, it indicates consumption of what's being held, and when the head is missing, it's offering and not consumption. But that, you need to know the entire series to get to this. And there are a few different examples here. You can have the head on its own as well. You can have the head as the point of reference. And the first one, the prayer gesture, the head's really just there to anchor the gesture. So sometimes you need to get into the script and understand a larger group of signs to work out what's salient and what is not. And there are some very interesting representational modes that you will easily miss if you're not looking for them, but every instance that you find where they are, to my mind, shows how very aware the scribes were of what they could do with their pictorial script. So here you have two relief depictions with writing, and you see here this writing in the winged sun disk with the titles Great King, and in the middle, both times the same name. It's the name of the King Totalia, but his name is spelled with two different signs that stand for the mountain. Now, these are inscriptions that are only a few meters apart. They're part of the same arrangement, a sacred place, and they're from the same period. So what's going on? And I would argue the difference is here. The one on the left has a relief of the king. That's it. And his name hieroglyph. The one on the right shows the king, and you see here he's the smaller figure. He's in this embrace of his personal god. And who's his personal god? He's the mountain god. Now here, because mountain is a sign that appears in his name, the mountain can be shown in the abstract. With the other relief, clearly they felt a desire to depict the mountain god. Now we can speculate why you would want to do that, but I love the difference between the two, and I do think it's deliberate and meaningful. This is another example where writing doesn't just write the text, and that's it. We have here the spelling of the name of the goddess Kubaba, and it's always been a bit weird that she has this bird in there, especially as normally the script does not put logograms in the middle of words. They're at the beginning of words in general. Very few exceptions, you have classifiers at the end of words, and again, I think that's cuneiform influence. But in the middle of a word, weird. Plus, what is it doing there? Because the writing really, Kubaba is her name, and you have the classifier for a god. So what is the bird doing there? And we have the bird as a sign of writing, and I think it's here to actually obstruct our reading. It makes us pause. This is an important word, it's a divine name, and I think it's there actually in a symbolic function to show us, yeah, she's the mistress of wild animals. So bird is one of her attributes. I don't think it's writing as such, it's what I would call meta-writing. Very limited, of course, to certain context, not constantly happening. And with that, I want to move on to classifier studies. We've been doing a lot there recently, and I'll show you what we've been doing. So the hieroglyphic script has classifiers very much from the beginning of the time that we can read it and that we have inscriptions. The system does expand and develop, and there are a few periods that are particularly strong in developing new trends. Some also don't last. One thing that's very important to understand about classifiers is they're always optional. So you can write them and you can leave them out. Otherwise, that's not how it works. What we haven't understood until recently is that we have both semantic and phonetic classifiers, and the phonetic classifiers as well are there from an early period, and they're actually quite productive. Now, I'm working with a group in Israel with the iClassifier structure, and they record quite a few different scripts, including Sumerian, but also Chinese, and several more, Egyptian, of course. And what's interesting is also, if we look structurally, what type of words use classifiers, and most other scripts are more limited than the Anatolian hieroglyphs. I think we are the ones who spread it out most. So nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, all of these can be written with a classifier. Originally, one of the thoughts was, why do you need a classifier? Well, maybe to disambiguate writing. So if you have homophone words, but then you add a classifier, then you make it clear what happens. And yes, that does happen. But I've searched, and I don't think I found a second example. I have one, but so I don't think that is actually why they're being used. So the most likely is this has to do with the economics of reading and of guiding the reading process, and they're very much used to activate different reading routes. So as we saw earlier, priming is something that is important here. And I'll take you through a few classifiers, starting with the semantic one. So normally they're always at the beginning of a word, which is very useful. So imagine here we want to write the horse or to ride, and you put a horse in front of it. So as you're reading, you're already thinking horse, 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 and then you read whatever comes after. That seems quite a useful position for doing that. we have the situation that the classifier can be used for several lemmata. So this is one that's very productive. We have some that are only used for one word, and then we have others like this one that is used for a whole range. And then, of course, it's very interesting to look at what group of words is classified by this. And it also goes the other way around. We sometimes have one lemma, and there are several classifiers that are used with it. That's not as frequent as the other way around, and the examples that I've found very much look like, at some point someone tried to make the connection between the classifier and what's being classified more obvious pictorially. And some of them held and others, like this one, do not. Now, the situation of phonetic classifiers is not something that I find is instinctively understandable. Certainly not to me, and but there is a clear structure at play, and from the psychology of reading, you can support it with theory as well. So it's by no means arbitrary. What we have is different signs that are used, and they occur in certain positions. They're either repeating a syllable or just a consonant from the beginning or the end of a word stem. Mind word stem, not the grammatical ending. Word stem in that sense is sensible because that's what marks this work. If we mark the third person singular, then that doesn't really help us to identify the word itself. And there are psychological studies that show this is actually something that is already activated in very young babies. They react to word edges differently than to the middle part of a word. So as humans, we seem to work with that. As an individual, I have not started noticing how I work with that, even though I'm looking for it. So clearly it happens on a less conscious level, and it's very interesting therefore to find it here deliberately being used, and it's used in a widespread and very well structured manner. So you see it works for most of the consonants that we have. And here are a few examples where we have the Mons 2 writing for totalia, so we're emphasizing the 2, the infans ni for Nimowitza. We've already looked at the he of this, and there it's really just the consonant, the vowel doesn't play a role. And a really even less intuitive one is when they use the closing consonant of the first syllable, as in Hamsi. But I have so many examples for this, and I can explain virtually every single instance of them using this, that this is what's happening. And you also have the same in stem final position. So if we compare the phonetic and the semantic classifiers, they share in general that they're optional. They also share that they're not read out, that they're reading aids. Their common usage, of course, differs a little bit. They can be combined. You can have several of those. And what they're doing, though, they seem to be priming us as we're reading, and the phonetic classifiers strengthen our access to the phonological lexicon, whereas the semantic classifiers help with the mental, the semantic lexicon. And then there are a few more categories that maybe not so important. Some of you may be familiar with this model of the dual route of reading in the brain. This follows very much to him. And we don't need to deal with all of the details, but the main point to take away from this is that we have both access as we're reading to the meaning and the sound of something. And let's maybe look at an English example. If you're reading I as I the person, it's different from the I that I'm looking with. Sounds the same, but the orthography is different. And in English, it's actually fixed via orthography that sends us to the correct lexicon that we need to activate to understand this. So this is a system that requires of the reader to learn things beforehand that are fixed and agreed upon by someone who's at some point invented this. So it doesn't make it easier on the reader in terms of learning to read, but once you've mastered it, reading actually becomes an efficient process. And the neuropsychologists have very much shown that when writing activates both routes through the brain, meaning and sound, if both are activated simultaneously, reading is much more efficient than if you just go for one of them. And you might say, oh, but why do we use alphabetic writing then? I've just given you the example. We still code for both. So I think these are maybe the most important takeaways from the two types of classifiers. So we have this differentiation between the semantic input that we're getting from the semantic classifier and really a strengthening of the word edges, which is still a bit of a ungraspable experience for me, but I believe it's there. The disambiguation of homophones happens rarely with semantic classifiers, but it's not an important category by any means. We think that this should lead to faster access with the phonetic classifiers to the phonological lexicon. And the interesting thing is when you have a phonetic classifier in front or in combination with a phonetic string, so the whole word written phonetically plus a phonetic classifier, they never use the identical sign. Whereas theoretically they could, and then it gets complicated though. I mean, what am I supposed to read? No, they're using a different sign. And that to a scribe clearly meant, I'm expected to do something different here. And you can also then use these words for some additional functions, and I think this is just a sort of add-on. It's not the original design, but the semantic classifiers very much help with word separation as you're reading, because they're generally in frontal position. And the phonetic classifiers enhance our access to the first or last syllable of the word. So to move on to the I classifier, this is an infrastructure maintained by Orly Goldwasser, Haleli Harel and Dimitri Nikolaev. And you see here it's already applied to quite a few languages, by the way, Hittite also. For the Luwian, we very kindly got digital data supplied by Ilya Jakubowicz, which we used to feed the iClassifier, and it's been prepared for iClassifier by Olga Olina. And she and I have been then reviewing and modifying this data. We're now in a pretty good state to be working with it. It's not accessible yet because we're still doing a few things to it, but I'll give you an idea of what we're doing. So we've got 11,000 plus tokens. Those are single word occurrences, and they equate to roughly 1,500 lemmas. And of our tokens, roughly about 20% have classifiers. And about half of these are names. We have a total of slightly short of 170 classifier signs that we've identified. Personally, I believe any semantic sign can be a classifier or a logogram, and it's down to the survival of the corpus whether we will find it in both positions or only in one of those. Now the iClassifier records location, date, genre, object type, script type, all kinds of metadata. And so the question really that we want to answer is, how do classifiers function? So we can do a network analysis on maps that visualize these classifiers with their lemmas. And then we're interested in questions like the frequency of classifier per lemma, how central the classifier is to a lemma, do classifiers combine with other classifiers, and what parts of speech are actually classified. And it's very nice that we can then, on top of defining this firstly for Anatolian, we can then compare it with other classifier scripts. So this gives you the whole classifier network map, and you see at this resolution, of course, we don't see much other than its pretty little bubbles in connection. So we need to start zooming in to get some sense of what goes on. And you see here, this is just a very small portion from this much larger cluster, but there you can already see you have always in the center of one of those bubbles, you have one classifier, and around it are all of the lemmas that are classified with it. And then you find the interconnections, etc. The map becomes a lot clearer once I say I only want one type of part of speech. So if I only want verbs, then it becomes somewhat more readable at a first glance. And this is what we get when we then look in detail. So here I've taken the classifier anima, which stands for animation. And if I ask the question of how frequent is it, I get this as a graphic, and you can see wherever these lines are thick, we have a lot more examples, but I also here have all of the examples counted, and what I'm not showing you, I have another portion on the screen where I actually have all of the examples as well. So we can ask at the same time also how obligatory is the classifier in any of these connections that we have, and here you see again stronger lines, and the darker color in the bubbles refer to the more frequent pairing within the lemma, in contrast to ones where we don't have it so much. And I already mentioned, we can also ask, does it combine with other classifiers? And here this one is one that does this quite a bit. And why is this interesting? This is interesting because we get a level of access to how the ancient scribe viewed his world and what were the mental categories in his brain when writing about his world. That's where it gets really fascinating. So we can look at things like symbolic representation, metaphorical shifts maybe. We want really to start grasping cognitive categories, because this tells us something about the knowledge that they have, the concepts of how their knowledge is organized. And of course relationships between categories and the various members of categories. So we get hierarchies as well of thinking networks, also of prototypes and things that are further removed. We can look at relationships across different parts of speech, so semantic groups. And of course, I'm very interested in the reading brain. So what does this tell us about the activation of words when we're reading them via the semantic or phonological route? In general, when we find structures, the point of having structures in scripts that are complex is very much to reduce the cognitive load. So that's very interesting to look out for as well. And what's the aim that the scribe has? Is it about being very precise? Is it about disambiguation? Are there other things? So here I've just, I wanted to give you a brief overview of the type of classifier categories that we have. I mean, you've already seen we have about 169 in total. So we have sort of the general animate category that goes from the divine versus the human to animals. And then we have quite a few body parts that act as classifiers. It makes a lot of sense as well. I mean, manual action, you'd use a hand, an arm, or whatever. Anything that's movement is nicely classified with legs, feet, etc. So those are relatively easy to understand. There's nature feeds into this system, man-made objects, mensural things, the lack of something. We have one number, we have the word for time. Space plays a role, and then, yeah, everyone's favorite category, uncertain. Nicely grouped together because we don't know. I'll come back to the example of the anima, which really presumably are little bubbles of breath being visible, as we know when the weather gets colder, you can see your breath. And there it's very interesting what type of animals are actually conceived of as animated with this classifier and which ones are not. So you see what I have on the left side gets animated with it, and what's on the right does not. Now on the left, you see in the middle circle you've got the lion. The lion is the prototype of the wild animal, and therefore within my model here a bit more central, whereas all of the others act as individual animals and therefore on the second tier. Then we have two that are animated, two signs, and I've written they're not animals. And you probably sit there and say, but what about that little rabbit? Of course, what's happening here is the rabbit is an animal, which is why he gets this, but a sign of writing is, in our corpus, never used to write the animal. It's actually used as a rebus writing. So we're animating something that, in the way we're reading it, is not animated. And the other one is a heart, which arguably plays a role in being animated, but maybe doesn't breathe itself. And on the right-hand side, most of them are easy to understand. So the Sphinx at the bottom is a mythical creature, let's forget about it. In the middle you have this sort of bird, fish, worms, grasshopper type category. And if we compare that to the left, I mean, they're just not mammals. So maybe animation is more associated with mammals. But what about the dog? And I cannot answer it with full confidence, but my feeling is the dog is an oddity because he's only ever mentioned twice in the corpus. So if we had more examples, it may be different. We might just have the two examples where they said, oh, but it's optional, we're not doing it here. But I can't prove it. So, what have we got? We see here a differentiation between animals having breath and not having breath. This is very interesting that you can actually relate it also linguistically. The Hittite Luwian term quitta for animal connects to the Indo-European stem for to breathe, in the same way that also in Latin animal and anima are related. So with that, I'm almost finished. I would like to emphasize once more how interesting the script itself and each individual sign is for understanding the ancient mind, and that's a new way of getting there that still bears a lot of potential. So sign shapes, we can relate them to objects from the environment at the time, and this is of course where we need to cooperate with archaeologists to have a far better grasp of what we're actually looking at here. The iconicity of how things are being depicted and which aspects of what you depict become salient in determining the sign of writing. All of those are fascinating questions, and the deeper I dig into this with this script, the more I see that things are so deliberate and structured and following certain guiding principles. You ask questions and you find things don't tend to be arbitrary. So, and then if you take structure, you can deal with the categories we find, the ordering principles of how their brain is structured, how they see the worlds. So taxonomic groups are very nicely represented by classifiers, and we see the hierarchies in them. We can compare group members versus non-group members, as you've seen here in the last instance. So I think this is a type of research, probably not just for this script, but for many others, that could open up avenues that maybe the texts don't write about. So with that, thank you very much.